The day began like any other, but the silence that followed carried a weight no one was prepared for. The heartbreaking news spread quickly through the community. Voddie Baucham had passed away. For years he had been a voice of strength, faith, and guidance, and now, the very people who once leaned on his words were left stunned and speechless. Some heard the news through close friends, others through quiet phone calls, and for many, it felt almost impossible to accept. The thought that the man who had spoken so passionately about life, love, and faith was no longer with them created an emptiness that could not be described in words. In homes across the city, tears quietly flowed as families sat together remembering his sermons, his laughter, and the way he made complicated matters of life seem simple through his wisdom. His loss wasn't just felt within his household, but in every corner of the community where his words had once been carried. For many, it felt like a guiding light had been suddenly taken away, leaving them in the shadows of grief. As the news settled, there was a strange stillness. People walked slower, spoke softer, and even in everyday routines, the absence of his presence was heavy. Friends exchanged calls not only to share the news, but to console one another, struggling to believe that the man they admired so deeply was truly gone. Voddie's passing was more than just the end of a life. It felt like the end of an era for those who had been touched by his message. The day of the funeral arrived, and the church was filled with a quiet heaviness that words could not capture. From the very entrance, people stood together, some holding hands, some wiping away tears, and others lost in silent prayer. The pews were packed, yet the hall still felt empty without the voice of the man they had all gathered to honor. The soft sound of the organ played in the background, creating an atmosphere that was both sacred and sorrowful. Everywhere one looked, grief was visible. Friends who had known Voddie for decades sat beside young faces who had only recently discovered his teachings, yet the pain was the same for all. Elderly members of the congregation leaned on walking sticks, whispering about how his words had carried them through hard times. Younger families held their children close, reminding them quietly of the lessons he had taught about love, strength, and faith. The hall was not just filled with people, it was filled with stories, memories, and emotions. Some came from distant towns and states, making the journey just to say goodbye, while others who could not find a seat stood quietly along the walls, unwilling to leave even if they had no place to sit. There was no division of background or status. Everyone sat side by side, united in grief and respect. The air itself felt heavy, carrying both sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for the loss of a man whose presence had been so deeply felt, and gratitude for the impact he had made in countless lives. In every bowed head and every tear-filled eye, it was clear that Voddie had left behind more than memories. He had left behind a legacy. As the church continued to fill with murmurs of grief, a sudden stillness came over the room. The doors opened slowly, and Voddie Baucham, the wife of Voddie, stepped inside. All eyes gently turned toward her, not out of curiosity, but out of deep respect for the woman who had walked side by side with him through every chapter of his life. Her steps were steady, yet each one carried the visible weight of sorrow. Dressed in a simple but graceful black dress, her face was marked with sadness, but there was also a quiet strength that could not be overlooked. People rose to their feet in silence, some lowering their heads, others holding back tears as they watched her walk down the aisle. The air shifted in that moment. Hearts ached for her loss, yet at the same time, they admired the dignity with which she carried herself. She moved slowly, her children walking beside her, their hands tightly holding on to hers as if drawing courage from their mother. It was a sight that pulled at every heart in the room, reminding them of the deep love and bond she and Voddie had shared. Bridget's presence was powerful in its simplicity. She did not speak a word, yet her silence carried a message that everyone could feel. Her grief was not hidden, but it was wrapped in grace, as if she had chosen to honor her husband not only through tears, but also through strength. Each step toward the front of the church was a testimony of the years they had spent together, a story of love, partnership, and faith that now stood at its most difficult moment. By the time she reached her seat near the front, the room was filled with an emotional hush. Many wept quietly, moved not only by their own memories of Voddie, but by the sight of a woman who had shared her life with him and now carried the burden of saying goodbye. In that moment, after a few moments of silence, Bridget slowly stood up from her seat and made her way toward the front. Every eye in the church followed her, and though the room was filled with hundreds of people, it felt as if time itself had paused. She stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she held onto a small piece of paper, but her voice, though heavy with emotion, carried a strength that immediately gripped the hearts of everyone listening. She began softly, her words breaking the silence. Voddie was not only my husband, but my best friend, my partner, and the greatest blessing of my life. Her voice wavered as she spoke, but she pressed on, determined to honor the man she had shared her life with. She talked about their first meeting, how his kindness had immediately stood out, and how she had always admired his unwavering faith. She described the way he cared for their family, never allowing his role as a public figure to overshadow his role as a husband and father. As she shared personal memories, the room grew heavier with emotion. She spoke about the little moments, his laughter at the dinner table, his habit of staying up late to read scripture, and the way he always found time to pray with their children before bed. These simple, everyday memories painted a picture of a man whose greatness was not only in his words to the world, but in the love he poured into his family. At times, Bridget had to pause, wiping away her tears before continuing. Yet even in her pauses, the silence was powerful. Many in the audience cried openly, touched by the purity of her words. Her tribute was not filled with grand or exaggerated stories, but with the raw truth of a life lived with love, sacrifice, and faith. She ended her tribute with a voice full of both pain and hope. Though I must say goodbye today, I know this is not the end. Voddie's legacy lives on in our children, in this community, and in every heart he touched, and I will carry his love with me until the day we meet again. As her final words echoed through the hall, the entire room erupted into a long, heartfelt applause, not as a celebration of loss, but as an honor to the life that had been lived. It was a moment that would stay with everyone who had been present, a tribute so stunning and sincere that it captured the very essence of who Voddie Baucham had been. As Bridget's final words lingered in the air, the church was wrapped in an overwhelming wave of emotion. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if her words had reached deep into every heart, pulling out memories, lessons, and unspoken feelings that people had carried with them for years. Slowly, the silence broke into soft sobs. Men who rarely showed emotion wiped their eyes, while women clutched handkerchiefs tightly, unable to hold back their tears. Many in the audience closed their eyes, silently replaying the times they had heard Voddie speak, moments where his words had given them courage in their darkest days or clarity when life felt confusing. Others thought of how his teachings had shaped their families, how his reminders of faith had helped them stand strong during trials. In that room, every person had their own story of how Voddie had touched their life, and Bridget's tribute had brought those memories rushing back like an open flood. The atmosphere was not only heavy with grief, but also filled with a sense of unity. Strangers comforted one another, gently placing a hand on the shoulder of the person beside them. Some stood to give quiet hugs, while others bowed their heads in prayer. It didn't matter where they came from or what their background was. Everyone was connected by the same loss, the same love, and the same respect for the man they were there to honor. When the audience finally began to clap after her tribute, it was not the kind of applause one gives after a performance. It was slow, deliberate, and full of reverence. It was a way of saying thank you, not only to Bridget for her courage, but to Voddie for a life that had been lived with such purpose. Tears and smiles mixed together, as people realized that though they had lost him physically, the lessons he had taught would remain alive within them. As the service drew to a close, a deep stillness once again filled the church. The organ played softly, its notes rising and falling like whispers of farewell. Bridget stood slowly, her children at her side, and together they walked toward the casket. The entire room held its breath, watching a family take the most difficult steps of their lives. When Bridget reached the casket, she placed her hand gently on its surface, her fingers lingering, as if she could still feel the warmth of the man she loved. With tears running down her cheeks, she bowed her head and whispered words only she and God could hear. Her children followed closely, each laying a hand upon the casket, their faces marked with both sorrow and love.